Hi, so for today we will be discussing about the digestive system. So, digestion begins at the oral cavity. So if you look at our digestive system, we can separate it into two parts. So you first have your gastrointestinal system or the GI tract, which begins at the oral cavity and ends at the anus. And aside from the GI tract, you also have accessory organs, which are your pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. Basically, the GI tract is the one where the food passes through in the midst of being broken down, absorbed, and of course expelled as waste from the body. And then you have the accessory organs to aid the other parts of the GI tract in doing that specific task. So the GI tract and accessory organs carry out 5 basic processes. Ingestion, where foods and liquids are taken into the mouth and eaten. Mixing, care of the smooth muscles in the walls of the GI tract, which mixes the food with digestive enzymes. Digestion, food is broken down by both mechanical and chemical processes. When we talk about mechanical, so most of one of the major things to look at that is the chewing. Food is broken down by our teeth, and in extension, during its passage in the GI tract, it's also further broken down by the peristaltic movement of the GI tract. And then for the chemical processes, you have your salivary amylases, you have the different enzymes, and even the bile salts that chemically degrade the food that you eat. Absorption. Epithelial cells lining the GI tract absorb the digested food molecules and pass them to the blood or the lymph. And defecation. Any substance not digested or absorbed for whatever reason is passed along to the end of the GI tract, which is the anus, and leaves the body. So this is the overview of your digestive system. So the GI tract starts from the mouth, the oral cavity, and you have continues on to the pharynx, and then to the esophagus, and down to the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, and out of the body through the anus. And then you have the accessory organs, the salivary gland, you have the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. And of course, the teeth and tongue is considered also. Basically, it's accessory. So let's look at the GI tract first. The structure of the GI tract is essentially a very long passageway. So it's generally the same along its entire length, and it's composed of 4 layers. You have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and serosa. Oh, by the way, the GI tract is basically one of the most exposed tissues or parts of the body aside from our skin. Now, anyway, look at these 4 layers because it's one of the most exposed to the outside environment. So you have the mucosa, the innermost layer, composed of a mucous membrane. So its main function is in absorption or secretion of liquids. The submucosa, which includes the glands, the nerves, and the blood supply for the tract itself. And the muscularis, which enables the movement of substances lengthwise. So the muscularis, from its name, muscle, basically. It's the smooth muscle layer of your GI tract. It's actually the reason for the peristaltic movement. The peristalsis is the movement of the tract that propels the food from the mouth towards the basically along the length of your GI tract. And then serosa is the outermost layer of your GI tract. So these layers work in unison to create the peristaltic wave that propels the food through the tube. So basically, the movement of the smooth muscles, the wave-like movement of the smooth muscles that propels the food through the GI tract is basically, we call that the peristalsis. So how does peristalsis work? So basically, it's just like if you have tried making sausages or, well, basically longanisa, how you prepare, how you push the meat down the skin. So that's basically somewhat like that. So you have here a system or a cycle of relaxed and contracted state for the muscles. So you technically push the muscles contract, and by the end of the the food bolus, and then it pushes down the food down. Okay, and then relaxes afterward. So basically, that's peristalsis. Now, moving on, let's start the transit of the food through the GI tract. So let's start with the oral cavity. So the oral cavity is composed of the cheeks, the tongue, the teeth, the hard and the soft palate, and the tonsils. So basically, when we talk about hard palate and soft palate, we call it yung ngala-ngala. So the teeth functions as the cutting tools. Well, this is for an omnivorous teeth. Okay, so we have the cutting tools, which are our incisors, the piercing and the ripping utensils, which are the canine teeth, the pointy ones. And then we have the grinding instruments, which are the molars and the premolars. So, and then, of course, during chewing, we also include, or rather, hydrates the food with our saliva to make it easier to move around. Now, this is the teeth of an omnivore. So, if we look at a carnivore, we will see a very different set of teeth. Most of them are canines. And then, if you look at herbivores, these are mostly molars. So, the teeth somehow, the teeth reflects the diet of the organism. So for humans, we are omnivores. So basically, we eat both meat and vegetables. So our teeth is, we have canines and we have molars. For those that have slightly different diets, so they might have a slightly different composition of and shape of the teeth. So in fact, those studying zoology, most of them look at the teeth to determine the diet of the organism. So mechanical digestion, basically when we say mechanical, it's the physical breakdown of the food by, of course, chewing them. So it increases the efficiency of the enzyme in the stomachs and the small intestines because it cuts down the food into smaller pieces. It increases the surface area so that the enzymes will have more room to actually act on digesting the food. So by creating small bits of food with great deal of surface area, basically it goes down to surface area to volume ratio. And then in the teeth also, we also have chemical digestion. Our saliva has amylases. We call it the salivary amylase. It breaks the starch into smaller bits, mostly into maltose and glucose. That is why, for example, you eat bread, although it doesn't contain sugar, or during the process of fermentation, the sugars in the dough had been eaten by the yeast, and it's mostly starch, or even rice. Before you swallow the rice, you will notice that if it's just plain rice, it tastes a bit sweeter by the end. That is because the sugars from the starch have been liberated. So when we say sugars from the starch, basically starch is a polymer of sugar. It's a polymer of carbohydrates. It's broken down to sugar. Its building block is the sugar. So the amylase breaks down the starch into its building blocks, and that's the sweetness because it's sugar. The sweetness that you taste, that's the aftertaste of rice. For the teeth, so we have our mouth contains hundreds of species of bacteria that live on the oral surfaces. So, because again, this is exposed to the outside world. So, bacteria uses the sugar from the foods that we eat for energy and produce wastes that are acidic. So, if the acidic waste sit on the enamel of the teeth, it can eat through it and then to the soft dentin and eventually into the pulp. So, you will technically have a cavity. So, they eat away. The acids from the bacteria dissolves and eats away at your teeth. So, a plaque is a combination of bacterial colonies, bacterial waste, and leftover sugars and saliva. So bacterial growth occurs 20 minutes after eating. So it's important to regularly brush your teeth and have a biannual dental cleanings to keep your teeth healthy and prevent plaque and, of course, cavities. And then, aside from that, we also have the tongue. The tongue manipulates the food into the bolus. So, aside from aiding us in our speech, the tongue is also the muscles responsible for moving the food around the oral cavity. So, it positions the bolus at the back of the oral cavity so it can be swallowed. So, this muscle can move in almost any direction in the oral cavity. Basically, it's the one that directs the food where it should be going. So on its surface, we have keratinized epithelium that covers each papilla, so creating a rough textures to help move the slippery food into position where the teeth can masticate it. When we talk about masticating, basically it's just chewing, or rather it is chewing. So taste buds resides along the sides of the papillae. So the tongue that also secretes watery mucus and a lipase. When we talk about a lipase, this is an enzyme that breaks down lipids. Lipids are the fats. Okay, so aside from the carbohydrates, we also have the fats of course in our food. And so the starts of breakdown of the fats also starts in the lipase in the oral cavity. So at the back of the oral cavity is the uvula, which hangs down from the soft palate. So basically, you call it the tonsils. So it functions to close off the nasal cavity when eating or drinking, so food goes into your throat and not in the nasal cavity. So at the back, the tonsils are at the back of the oral cavity. So it's the first line of defense against any microbe that may enter your mouth along with the food. So when bacteria invade the oral cavity, the tonsils swell as they attempt to destroy the pathogen through the action of specific immune tissues. So we start with the tonsil, which the mucosa of the GI tract also contains a disease prevention tissue called MALT, or the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues. So basically, the tonsils together with the MALT, they also serve as a protective role in our digestive tract. So if you are prone to having tonsillitis when you are young, especially in my case, I tend to have tonsillitis when I was young. That is my basically invasion. That is because of the invasion of bacteria in the oral cavity and the actions of the lymph nodes in the tonsils. So a swollen lymph node, that's a tonsillitis. So you have that means it's fighting off a bacterial invasion. So the MALT consists of nodules of lymphatic tissue. So lymphatic tissues, these are parts of our immune system. So they prevent pathogens from taking over the lumen of the digestive tract. The lumen, which is basically the tissues lining of your digestive tract. So MALT tissues represent a large percentage of the entire immune system. So we have MALT tissues present in basically most different body surfaces. So including about half of the body's total lymphocytes and macrophages. So without the MALT, pathogens could grow within the digestive tract, penetrate the epithelial lining, and cause serious internal infections. Because as I said, the GI tract is exposed to the outside world. Although it's located inside our bodies, but technically it's exposed to the outside because you have an opening, of course, in your mouth, and then another one at your at the bottom. So you have it's basically like a tube inside our bodies. So it's exposed, very well exposed. Okay, so that's for the tonsils. Now let's look at the salivary glands. So the salivary glands are located within the oral cavity. So they secrete small amounts of watery saliva to moisten the oral mucosa. When the total smell of food can increase salivary production. So when you're hungry and you smell something good, so it is actually a trigger for the production of the saliva. So when food is in the mouth, excess saliva is needed to mix with the food and form the slippery bolus required for swallowing. So the major salivary glands are the parotid glands, which are located below and in front of the ears. They produce watery saliva that includes some ions, the sodium, potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate, and the phosphate ions and other organic substances. We also have the submandibular glands below the mandible. Mandible is your basically the jawbone. So the submandibular glands produce a thicker, ropey saliva with similar ion content but a larger concentration of mucus. And then the sublingual glands, it's below the tongue. When we talk about lingual, it's technically is tongue. It means tongue. I think it's a Latin Latin word originally. So anyway, it produces only 3 to 5% of your total saliva. So you have three glands below and in front of your ears, the parotid, the one in your jaw, which is the submandibular, and then below your tongue. So those are the glands. Actually, if you notice carefully, that's where you actually produce the saliva. So the saliva also contains lysozyme. This is an enzyme that helps destroy bacteria in the oral cavity. So it contains salivary amylase, which is a digestive enzyme that breaks carbohydrate and polysaccharides into your monosaccharides. As I told you, that's where the chemical digestion starts. Now, swallowing, or more technically called deglutition, so it occurs as the bolus of macerated food. Macerated food, that means chewed food, is moved to the back of the throat. So the tongue positions the bolus at the opening of the esophagus and is consciously controlled. So this is also the reason why we cannot inhale while swallowing. Okay, so remember, in the pharynx, there is an intersection of your respiratory tract and your GI tract. So in the case of inhalation, the esophagus, or rather your glottis, is basically open, so the air can pass through to your larynx and onto your trachea. But during swallowing, your trachea must be covered. That is because the trachea is located at the anterior or in front of your esophagus. So that's one of the reasons why choking is a hazard. So if people choking on food, so that means the glottis was not properly closed, and so instead of the food going to the esophagus, it blocks the larynx and the trachea, so you can't breathe. So that is one of the thing that must be careful about, especially for the elderly, where the control of these, the closing, the control of your some of the actions, voluntary actions, and even the closing is quite difficult. So once the bolus reaches the pharynx, it's under the involuntary control until the external anal sphincter. So once you swallow the food, you can no longer control it until it reaches the rectum for defecation. So the vascularis of the GI tract is a smooth muscle controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So, but the anal sphincter is a skeletal muscle. That's why you can control where you defecate, but you cannot control the passage of your food in your GI tract itself. Now, swallowing involves three stages. You have the voluntary stage, where you consciously swallow your food. Of course, you stop breathing at this stage. And the pharyngeal stage, the bolus involuntarily passes through the pharynx. The epiglottis is closed against the larynx to allow the bolus to bypass the respiratory system and enter the esophagus. So the uvula also covers the nasal opening, and the larynx moves upward against the epiglottis. So basically, that's why that if you feel the Adam's apple moving upward when you actually swallow. And then you have esophageal stage. The food moves through the esophagus into the stomach via peristalsis. So the bolus, the chewed food, is pushed along the esophagus in a controlled manner. So the esophagus terminates in its lower end with a sphincter muscle called the lower esophageal sphincter. It opens as the bolus touches it and drops the bolus into the upper portion of the stomach. So why is it closed? So that's to prevent stomach juices from entering your esophagus, because the stomach acids, inside the stomach, it's quite acidic there. So the stomach has lining that prevents that's resistant to the acid, and of course to the enzymes in the stomach. But the esophagus has no such protection. That is why if you vomit for hyperacidity, it hurts in your throat, because the acids, the contents of the acidic stomach had transverses the esophagus and does some damage to your esophagus. So you need to actually try to drink water after vomiting, so that it washes down the acid in the esophagus. So the esophagus connects the pharynx to the stomach and passes through the opening of the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. So remember the diaphragm at the end of your lungs that allows you for breathing. So since the esophagus transverses that, because the stomach is below the it's below the diaphragm. So you have an opening in the diaphragm for the esophagus. So this is basically the swallowing, stages of swallowing. So basically this is the voluntary stage, and then B is your pharyngeal stage. So if you notice during the pharyngeal stage, you have your glottis. So normally it is open when we are breathing. So this is your larynx and towards the trachea. But if you swallow, the glottis, this one, the epiglottis, it covers your larynx so that you won't choke on your food. The same goes for your uvula. So your uvula covers your nasal passage, so that the food, the bolus, will not enter your nasal cavity. So the stomach put food to the acid test. So the stomach is a J-shaped organ that lies beneath the esophagus. So the stomach has 3 layers of smooth muscles in its muscularis layer. So you have circular, longitudinal, and oblique. So the oblique layer is extra and allows for maximum contraction, allowing the stomach to churn and mix the food with digestive juices. The mucosa layer of the stomach contains special folds called the rugae that permit expansion of the stomach while we eat. So if you are full, if you notice your stomach expanding, well, basically that's because it's expanded. The mucosa layer also secretes a protective, thick, viscous, alkaline mucus. So this is the alkaline. This is, when we talk about alkaline, this is basic. So this is to neutralize your the acidic chyme from the stomach. So the stomach is separated from the esophagus and the small intestine by 2 sphincter muscles. So we have the lower esophageal sphincter, which is the upper boundary, and we have the pyloric sphincter that marks the lower end of your stomach, so that the food can be stored and, well, not exactly stored, but it will stay in the stomach until digested. So the pyloric sphincter is the strongest sphincter muscles of your digestive tract. So it opens to allow chyme to enter the small intestine only when it's chemically ready. So this sphincter is so powerful that it can cause projectile vomiting in infants. So that's your pyloric sphincter. So this is your J-shaped organ, the stomach. So its function is to churn and mix the bolus with the acid environment of your stomach. So it also is if the salivary amylase and the lipases are just some sort of patikim for the chemical digestion, this is where the major part of the chemical digestion occurs. So this is your stomach. So this is the pyloric sphincter. Now the duodenum, this is part of the small intestine. So the rugae, if you look at the rugae of your mucosa layer of your stomach, it's just basically folds, parang wrinkles. It's similar to wrinkles. So when your stomach expands, it just straightens out. So let's look at the glands of the stomach. These gastric glands produces the different enzymes that allows for chemical digestion. So the chief cells, which secretes pepsinogen and the gastric lipase. Pepsinogen is a precursor of your pepsin. Pepsin is the enzyme that this is the enzyme that digests proteins. So it's converted to pepsin by the hydrochloric acid. So that means pepsinogen can only be activated in acidic environment. So hydrochloric acid that is produced by the parietal cells in your stomach. Now, speaking of parietal cells, so they're the ones that produce the hydrochloric acid. So this hydrochloric acid allows a low pH. So your stomach is acidic. So at the same time, it activates the pepsin and kills the microbe. So the intrinsic factor is needed for the absorption of vitamin B12, so which is a micronutrient that helps produce red blood cells. And then we have the mucous cells that secrete a thick layer of mucus to protect the lining of the stomach from the enzyme and acid. This is also one of the reasons why we have two openings, or rather two doorways in the stomach, one at the top and another at the bottom. That is usually closed because the interior of the stomach is acidic, and it might be detrimental, or rather it is detrimental to the rest of the GI tract. So that's to prevent exposure of the esophagus from the stomach contents, and at the same time, again, for the intestines, the prevention of the pyloric sphincter to prevent the chyme to proceed to the smaller intestines without proper processing. So aside from chemical digestion, we also have mechanical digestion. So remember, we have several layers of muscles in your stomach. So movement of those muscles are basically the mechanical digestion. So these are the mixing waves. So they occur every 15 seconds or so and help break up the food. So the food may stay in the fundus of the stomach for as long as an hour before moving into the body of the stomach. So what is the fundus? That's the upper, since this is a J, or rather than a J, to me it looks like a bean, kidney beans. So the fundus is the upper part of your stomach. So it usually stay in the fundus for as long as an hour before being moved to the body of the stomach. So the mixing waves are vigorous at the body of the stomach, pushing the chyme into your pyloric sphincter. So with each wave, a small portion of the chyme is forced through the pyloric sphincter and into the small intestine. So some of the chyme is too big to move through the pyloric sphincter and is kicked back to the body of the stomach to be churned further. So that means unless your chyme is small enough, it won't be released from your stomach. So this basically the different phases of your digestion. The cephalic phase, or the first phase, wherein thoughts of the food and the feel of food in the oral cavity stimulates increased secretion from the gastric pits. The gastric pits are those that release the different enzymes, the acids, and the mucus in the stomach. So, and then you also have the gastric phase. So when the bolus reaches the stomach, the second phase of gastric digestion begins, where the stomach produces gastrin, as well as continuing the production of pepsin and hydrochloric acid. So gastrin is basically an enzyme. It aids in stimulation of the gastric pits, providing a feedback system that speeds digestion. Impulses from the stomach also go back to the brain, maintaining contact with the nervous system. Actually, if you are dieting, it's one of the hormones that you need to watch out for, which is the gastrin. So intestinal phase is the final phase of gastric digestion, where the chyme begins to leave through the pyloric sphincter. As the chyme leaves the stomach, gastrin production decreases, and the impulses to the brain indicate a lessening of the chyme, and the brain begins to slow the stimulation of the gastric pits. So it's slowing down because basically the food is done from the stomach. So at the same time, hormones from the beginning portion of the small intestine initiate activation of your small intestine. Because the job of the stomach is done, so it slows down the production or the secretion of the pepsinogens and the different enzymes and acids in the stomach. So anyway, that's the three phases of digestion in the stomach. So all in all, the digestion in the stomach starts before you even swallow your food. Just inhaling or thinking about food, your gastric juices starts to ready themselves to receive the bolus. So regulation of gastric emptying. So after it's done in the stomach, so this in the small intestine, the chyme itself stimulates the release of the hormones. So the chyme containing glucose and fatty acids causes the release of the hormone cholecystokinin and secretin. CCK inhibits the stomach emptying. So secretin decreases gastric secretions. So both of them also affect the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder and the accessory organs of the GI tract. Their combined action holds the food in the stomach for a prolonged period, ensuring the food is sufficiently broken down. So So after 2 to 4 hours, the chyme has emptied from the stomach and has entered the small intestine. So why the range of time? Again, it depends on how easy or fast the food is digested. If you have protein-rich food, it tends to stay in your stomach longer because most of the protein should be digested in the stomach. Remember, if you remember the from previous slides, the chemical digestion in the mouth only involves carbohydrates and lipids, but in our diet we also have the proteins. So what about them? So the protein starts digesting at the stomach itself. Actually, the main digestion that the stomach does is digesting proteins. So the higher the protein content, the longer your food in the stomach is. So sometimes the food in the stomach does not agree with the stomach because it contains bacteria or toxin that irritate the stomach lining. So it may cause vomiting, which is a mechanism to quickly rid the pathogens from the body. So if you eat spoiled or rotten food, so you will have it won't agree with your stomach. So your GI tract will do its best to quickly get rid of this. So it's either by vomiting it out. Usually that's why one of the main symptoms of food poisoning is vomiting or diarrhea. So it flushes it out immediately out of the body. So moving on to the intestine and the accessory organs. So the small intestine has the 3 regions. The duodenum, which connects to the stomach and is 25 centimeter long. The jejunum, in the middle portion, it's 2 meters long. And finally, the ileum, which connects to the large intestine at the ileocecal valve and at the longest portion, which is 3.5 meters long. So basically, your small intestine is very, very long. So this organ is the only portion of the GI tube where nutrients are absorbed into the blood or the lymph. So the small intestine is covered by folds of the peritoneum called mesenteries. So the small intestine is folded up in circular folds which contain finger-like extensions called the villi. So why do we have the villi? This increases the surface area of your intestines so that there are more surface area, the more absorption there is. So the villi house the blood capillaries and the lymphatic capillaries which absorb the nutrients. Why do we need, again, the linings of the small intestines are covered by microvilli which increases the surface area available for absorption. Because how do we absorb the nutrients? Absorbing the nutrients in the food involves the passage of the said nutrients through the different receptors in our intestine. Actually, that is one of the issues regarding food supplements, especially if you remember the glutathione fad several years ago. One of the main issues with get glutathione, or rather intaking glutathione through the oral tract. Basically, if you swallow glutathione pills, it's disputed because glutathione is a polypeptide. It's basically protein. So your stomach degrades protein. So it's not sure if it survives the stomach acid intact in the first place. And if it does survive intact, when it reaches down to your small intestine has specific receptors. So they do not necessarily absorb anything at once. So, for example, they have receptor that only allows sugars, glucose, and simple sugars to pass through and not the larger sugars such as the starch. That is why you need to degrade the starch first before absorbing it. So, your intestine cannot absorb the larger polysaccharides, only the smaller monosaccharides. So unless degraded properly, it won't be absorbed. That's also another reason why you have the glycemic index. And for diabetic individuals, you have a possible problem when you intake too much sugar versus a food that has, for example, potato. The starch in potato take a while to digest. So it is gradually absorbed by the body and it won't really give you a spike of basically a hyperglycemic spike. Unlike if you eat, say, sugar-rich foods like pastries, cakes, so the carbohydrates in those sweets and pastries are quite easy to break down into its monosaccharide, and that induces a really high or a very fast and large sugar spike in our blood, in our basically system. So those are one of the things considered during absorption of food. And as I was talking about the glutathione a while ago, with the stomach receptors are known to absorb amino acids, but there is no known receptor, as far as I know, that can absorb proteins or polypeptides itself. So it's not really sure if you are absorbing the glutathione you intake from your food, and that's the reason for the dispute. So if you look at it in a molecular way, there is no known way to absorb the glutathione, but it's not known whether the effect that was observed is actually from absorption of the glutathione or just absorption of the precursors. So anyway, that's for that. So the lining of the small intestine are covered in microvilli. The total surface area of the small intestine is about 260 square meters. So anyway, this is your villi of your small intestine. So these are the serosa, the muscularis layer, the submucosa, where the different blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels are. And then this is your vilus. So this is the vilus. So if you notice, these are very small finger-like protrusions. So many of these, they increase surface area of your small intestines. So the cells here allows or rather they have receptors that allows the passage of the different nutrients into your awaiting blood vessels. And then you also have the lymphatic vessels at the same time, because of course there might be some unwanted pathogens in the intestines that escape the stomach, and so this is to guard against those pathogens. So this is actual view of those small intestine under a microscope. So this is the mucosa layer. These are your villi. Okay, so looking at them closely, there are actually protrusions like that. So these are individual cells of your villi with hair-like extensions. So these are individual cells itself. Okay. So about the malts and mechanical digestion. So like in the tonsils, we also have malts in the small intestine. Actually, a lot of malts. So we have these malts are called the Peyer's patches. So these nodules of lymphatic tissues are similar to the tonsils. The Peyer's patches are important part of the immune system. So they protect the lumen of the digestive tract from bacterial invasion. So mechanical digestion occurs in peristaltic waves called segmentations and migrating motility complexes. So segmentations are localized mixing waves, mixing the chyme with the digestive enzymes. Because the chemical digestion is still continuing. Migrating motility complexes occurs when nutrients are absorbed and moves the chyme the entire length of the small intestine to the large intestine. So the small intestine also have its own chemical digestion. So most of the carbohydrate digestion occurs here. So it begins with the pancreatic amylase from the pancreas. So if you have salivary amylase in our saliva, we have pancreatic amylase produced by the pancreas. Why? Because the salivary amylase are degraded in the stomach, because they are basically enzymes, and enzymes are protein. So they are inactivated and degraded by the acidic environment in the stomach. Now, since we no longer have the salivary amylase, we need a different amylase when the food enters the small intestine. So that's the pancreatic amylase. Digestion is completed using brush border enzymes, the sucrase, the lactase, and the maltase. When we say brush border enzymes, these are the ones attached to your small intestine, the walls or the linings. So protein digestion uses trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and elastase secreted from the pancreas. So if the if your stomach has the pepsin, the different the pancreatic enzymes, which are the trypsin, the chymotrypsin, the carboxypeptase, these are the counterpart for the protein digestion in the small intestine. So digestion is completed again using brush border enzyme, aminopeptidase and dipeptidase. And then the lipid digestion, where the most significant fat digesting enzyme is made by the pancreas, called the pancreatic lipase. So most of the different food sources are digested here. So this is your stomach lining. So your proteins, the dietary fat, and the carbohydrates are broken down into its components, the simple sugars, fructose, glucose, and galactose. And then they are transported through, if it's fructose, it's facilitated diffusion. And if it's glucose, it's more of an active transport, absorbing sodium ions at the same time. So we also have the amino acids. So proteins are broken down to its component amino acids, and again through an active transport inside your cells. Now we say it's active transport. When we say active transport, we have specific passages for those specific amino acids and sugars. And then you have the fats, which are broken down, or rather divided into smaller micelles by the bile salts, and further digested or broken down by the lipases, the pancreatic lipases, into its fatty acid and monoglyceride components, and then absorbed by your intestines. So these are the cells of the small intestine. And then those absorbed nutrients are then passed through to your capillaries, to the blood, basically the bloodstream. Now, ulcers. Ulcers are wounds in the mucosa of the GI tract. So here is an example of an ulcer near the sphincter. So they are persistent and painful and resist healing. So they are mostly caused by the infection with Helicobacter pylori. It's a spiral bacterium that thrives in the acidic stomach. When we talk about bacteria or the names of most microorganisms, it's mostly named based on their shapes and form. When you say Helicobacter, it means, well, it's spiral because from the name helix. So you have a spiral bacterium, and it's found in the, well, your pyloric sphincter. So it's called not exactly pyloric sphincter, but your stomach, which is that's why it's called pylori. So you have those cases. Now since it's bacteria, it can be treated with antibiotics. Now in the next video, we'll discuss about the different accessory organs in your the GI tract.